wonderful to see so many folks. I see we've got a running start on homecoming weekend, as well as our own community of faculty and staff and students, and that's just wonderful to have everyone here. It is a great honor, as always, when Fred Bergsten is in town. He has been so gracious with his time and expertise in sharing with us in one setting or another. And so we are greatly honored to have him here today. I've always said that Fred has the amazing capacity, for me amazing anyway, to take a subject that I consider very complex and make it not only comprehensible, but compelling. And so I look forward very much to hearing you today, Fred. Fred, as I think you know, is a frequent author. He's written many books. Last week he had an op-ed piece, a brilliant piece in the New York Times. He was on NPR yesterday morning. Frequently, radio and television stations seek him out when there is a need for an expert opinion on a topic that, of course, is very much of concern to all of us, which is the global economy. And so today he's going to link some thoughts about the global economy and the situation, the political situation, the election in the United States in 2012. So please give a hearty welcome to Dr. Fred Bergsten.
Marianne, thanks very much. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see everybody here in Fayette, as always, but particularly this year, because as many in the audience know, this is the 50th reunion of my own class, the class of 1961, and hey. So many of the class are here, as you can tell. It's going to be a great weekend for all of us, and it's a thrill for me to be able to start off with some remarks today. Before I start on my topic, I'm going to abuse my position as class agent for 1961 group to tell everybody in the audience about two events happening tonight which are not on the printed program. The first, and this is really a spectacular event, is going to be a special dramatic performance at 8 o'clock in the Little Theater of a very famous play known as Love Letters. It's a two-person play, and the two persons are President Inman and Mark Kelty, the head of the drama department. This is a reprise of their having, or Marianne's having done it 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It was so, talk about compelling, it was so compelling that when I had an opportunity to organize the program for our class reunion, my first thought was to ask Marianne if she could do it again. So she is, with Mark Kelty, who's terrific, you may know. And so you're all invited. It's for our class, but everybody's invited to the play at the Little Theater at 8 o'clock. Then after that, but this is only for our class because not too many people can participate, Dr. Larry Peary has offered to open the observatory, and it's a gorgeous day and hopefully night, so we can look at the moons of Neptune and the rings of Saturn and some of the star clusters. So right after the play, those of you who want, we will go out to the observatory and look through the big telescopes up at the sky. So it should be an interesting evening for all of us with lots of star power, starting with Marianne. I did want to say a few words, since there's so much concern these days about the world economy, the U.S. economy, and of course integral to that, U.S. politics. Lots of gloom and doom going around, and I've heard that from a number of you. The gloom and doom is to some extent justified, and I'll talk about that, but you have to remember in looking at the global economic situation that half the world is booming. The emerging markets, led by China, India, Brazil, but all of Asia, in fact all of the developing and emerging economies, Latin America, even sub-Saharan Africa, it may shock you to learn they are booming. They are growing at an average of more than 6%. They are looking very good for the long run as well as the short run. They are carrying the world economy at this point. So half the world, and they do now make up half the world, are doing very well. Unfortunately, it's not our half of the world. Our half of the world, not just the US, but the other traditional rich, high-income countries, Western Europe, Japan, are flat on their backs. Sluggish, struggling. I'll describe a little bit about that, say what ought to be done to deal with it, and then make a few predictions as to where we are going from here over the next couple of years, and particularly as we look at the election year here in the United States next year. But when one looks at the world economy today, it really is a tale of two very different groups of countries. As I say, the emerging markets are now completing a decade of very rapid economic growth. I talked about China here 2 years ago. I won't say too much about it today, but China continues to grow at 9 to 10% a year. China by itself makes up 10% of the world economy. So if it's growing at 10%, that means it's adding 1% a year to global growth. Global growth's about 4%, so China all by itself is a quarter of world economic growth. The United States is less than half that. The US is 20% of the world economy, but we're only growing 2%. So that's less than half a percentage point of global economic growth. In short, China is more than twice as great a driver of the world economy as the United States, just by itself. But then you add the rest of East Asia, South Asia led by India, Latin America led by Brazil. You add all those parts of the world, and the rapid growth I'm talking about in the emerging markets is pervasive. It includes all parts of the developing world, including the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa. That whole group is averaging growth of more than 6% now for over a decade. It accounts for 80% of world economic growth, and the long-run outlook for it is very strong. We recently did a projection at my institute of the outlook for budget deficits of all parts of the world over the next 30 years, and the numbers are rather frightening. For the rich countries as a group, the debt to GDP ratio is on a trajectory headed toward 200%. Now, anything above about 60 or 80 is danger zone, red lights flashing, non-sustainable. So the 200% will never happen, because between now and then, either policy will head it off or crises will intervene and force the countries to adjust. But those are the trajectories. Japan is headed toward 300%. The United States, 240. Europe, only 170. By contrast, the emerging markets as a group, 50. In short, they are in much stronger fiscal position than we. Their lead is going to grow, not decline. They'll be able to take measures to respond to crises. They'll be able to respond to unforeseen needs. They won't have such crowding out of private investment, high interest rates, as we do from these massive budget deficits. In short, the emerging markets are not only now leading the world, it looks like their superior performance is going to accelerate over the years ahead. Now, I'm not going to talk most of the time about them today, but I do want to start with that because it's critical to have it in perspective. These countries are, as I say, driving the world economy. They're growing more than 3 times as fast as we are. They average more than 6. We average less than 2. They're growing 3 times as fast as we are. Simple math tells you their share of the world is therefore rising by a couple of percentage points every year. So if you ask me back in 10 years, when our class has its 60th reunion, these countries will be 2/3 of the world economy, or even more. So this is a sea change in the composition of world economic activity, therefore world economic power. There's a big change going on in the international economic institutions to reflect this change. Not happening as fast as the economic change, but with increased roles and shares for the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils of this world, with a corresponding decline in the positions of the United States and particularly Europe and Japan. So if you want to look at it in sort of zero-sum struggle political science terms, what you're seeing is a historic shift in the underlying power structure of the world economy. Now the Chinese and Indians don't like the term emerging economies. They say, well, we're just the re-emerging economies. Because when you look at the history of the world economy, until somewhere around 1750, historians differ on the precise date, but somewhere around 1750, perhaps as late as 1800, China and India by themselves made up half the world economy. Then they went into a long decline, which they regard as a short-run aberration in their otherwise long-term dominant position. And so they regard things as now getting back to normal, with China, the Middle Kingdom, again resuming a key and critical role. One of my colleagues at my institute, we published a book by him just 2 weeks ago. The title of the book is Eclipse. where, to be provocative, he pushed the thesis that China's dominance is now occurring so rapidly and will become so pervasive that within a decade or two it will have eclipsed the United States as the world's dominant economy, and we better get used to being number two. Now, it's a very provocative thesis. A lot of people, including myself, have reservations about pieces of it, but it tells the basic kernel of truth. Unless we get our act together, unless we start shaping up substantially, and we'll talk about that, we do face a very critical change in global economic circumstances. On some metrics, depends how you define it, on some metrics, China has already passed the United States to become the world's largest economy. On any metric, it will do so in the next 5 to 10 years. It's already the biggest trading country, by far the biggest owner of foreign exchange reserves. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's so critical, I need to spell it out. And lest I sound uncritical about China and the other emerging markets, let me reiterate another point that I think dwelled on 2 years ago, namely that China in particular gets part of its dramatic, successful economic performance by cheating. China cheats very, very fundamentally in some very central ways in its involvement in the world economy. The most notable is manipulating its exchange rate. And I mention that in part because as we speak, the U.S. Senate, literally as we speak, is debating a bill that would retaliate against China for its currency manipulation. What the Chinese do is spend $1 to $2 billion every day in the foreign exchange markets, buying dollars, selling their own currency. That keeps the exchange rate of the dollar excessively high. It keeps the exchange rate of their currency excessively low, and that gives them a huge further competitive advantage, our estimate 20 to 30% in world trade. Now that is cheating on the most fundamental rules of the game. Some of you may have read the history of the 1930s, during which the deep recession around the world was converted into a Great Depression by a combination of trade protectionism and competitive currency devaluation by major countries, all trying to get an edge on each other in international competition. The whole post-World War II system of the world economy, the so-called Bretton Woods system, was constructed to avoid a replication of those disastrous events. And it's pretty well held for 50 years. It's now undergoing its first real stress test because China, which is now the world's maybe largest economy, largest trading country for sure, is cheating by competitively keeping its exchange rate weak, meaning that it exports unemployment to the United States and other countries and disrupts the global economic system. That has now become intolerable in a world where we have high unemployment, slow growth, huge economic problems, and they're booming. And indeed, their main problem is now inflation, not growth and creating jobs. The Senate has finally given up on the administration to do something about it. The global economic system has been ineffectual, to be honest, in doing anything about it, partly because countries are afraid to take on China, since it's now such a great power. And so some hell may break loose in terms of legislation in Washington, but more broadly, international economic conflict. And that would be the horror story, the nightmare replication of what happened in the 1930s, which, if things went off the rails here over the next few months or years, could in fact bring all our economies into deeply serious difficulty. So that's to add to the gloom and doom, but at the same time to have noted that there is a whole body of world economies doing well, keeping things afloat, and at this point at least, keeping the world economy growing at a reasonable rate of 4% or so, which if that continues, will at least not have any deep disasters. But as I say, they're big risks. Now let me turn to the half of the world that is struggling. The so-called advanced countries, not clear how advanced we now are, given the way we behave, but the high-income countries, the US, Western Europe, and Japan, which until fairly recently had been thought of as making up the bulk of the world economy, the big three, the trilateral countries, whatever you want to call them. Again, the underlying problems are pervasive. The US has not been quite as in deep trouble as Europe lately, but we were in worse trouble a couple of years ago. So it's a fair generalization to say that the three
high-income, big economies, US, Western Europe, Japan, have all fallen into deep, deep difficulty. And there is a common problem and common reason why we are now having such prolonged, deep economic problems. That reason was the financial crisis that hit us all 3 to 4 years ago.
Many people, including some high officials like the president and some others, have expected to be able to restore U.S. economic growth rather quickly after the turndown of a couple of years ago, thinking of it as a traditional recession. Now, in a traditional recession, what happens is a country, for a variety of reasons, subjects itself to high inflation. The Federal Reserve, the central bank, then raises interest rates, sometimes quite high, like around 1980, in order to wring inflation out of the system. Those high interest rates push the economy into a recession, but then you can ease interest rates, you can apply fiscal stimulus, tax cuts, spending increases, and get the economy back in shape. That's a traditional, cyclical kind of economic problem and policy response. The difficulty was that this time it was very different. This was not a cyclical recession brought on by inflation and tight Fed policy and all that. This was a much more pervasive problem brought on by a near collapse of our financial system, and likewise now happening in Europe. One of my senior fellows at my institute, a woman named Carmen Reinhardt, who's by far the top female economist in the world and winning new prize after prize week after week for having done a seminal study of the history of financial crises, going back literally, if you can believe it, 8 centuries, with enormous amounts of data over the last 200 years. And 2 or 3 very basic lessons emerge. When you have a sharp economic turndown that is brought on by a collapse of your financial system, it is not easy to get out of it. Indeed, you need to expect a prolonged period, she estimates 7 to 10 years, to be able to recover to where you were prior to the onset of the crisis. And the reason is because to get your economy functioning normally again, you have to reverse the over-leveraging, the excess lending, the excess borrowing, the whole range of financial excesses that brought on that crisis. In short, you have to deleverage. Governments have to deleverage, they've run into big debts. Households have to deleverage, they've overborrowed and overconsumed. Businesses, and banks in particular, have to deleverage because they've gotten overexposed and their balance sheets have weakened. It's sometimes called a balance sheet recession. But the point is, when it's brought on by a financial implosion, as it was in this case, you cannot expect to bounce back in any short-term period. Whether it's 7 to 10 years or a little less, people debate that. But you're going to have a prolonged period. We're already into our 4th year, 5th, depending how you count it, of slowdown and stagnation resulting from the economic and financial downturn that began in this country toward the end of 2007 and then big time with the collapse of Lehman in 2008. So one result is prolonged slowdown. The second result that the history demonstrates occurs is a huge increase in your budget deficit, your government budget deficit. In fact, Carmen's prediction is that in periods of this type, the ratio of your budget, your debt, your federal debt to GDP tends to double. And the reason for that is twofold. A, the economy slows down, so revenue growth slows down, may even go into reverse. You have to spend a lot of money to get out of the crisis. You have to bail out banks and companies like we did in this country big time. You have all sorts of other expenditures. Unemployment compensation costs go way up. Other expenditures to deal with the downturn itself go way up. And so you have to expect a doubling of your national debt position. And the U.S., I have to say, is right on schedule. We went into the crisis with a debt to GDP ratio of 40%, which is not bad. Now we're already at 80. And as I said, we're on a trajectory to 200 over the next 20 years if we stayed on the current path. The U.S. budget deficits now, reasonably projected from where we are now, are over $1 trillion a year for the next decade. That is obviously unsustainable. The congressional deal reached in August, which I'll say a little more about later if I have time, did absolutely nothing repeat nothing to deal with it. The first budget cutting legislation, in my experience, that didn't cut a single dime out of the budget. It set up a bunch of processes which are unlikely, in my view, to succeed. And so they've done so far nothing about it. But that's the second effect. Your budget deficits go way up, and so you're going to have to deleverage over time. A third effect is that partly because of the first two, you have to expect slower growth in the future. Once the debt to GDP ratios get up above 80%, certainly above 100%, there's a very clear statistical correlation that your economic growth drops by 1–1.5% per year from where it was prior to the crisis. Now, if you're only growing at 2 to 3, that means your growth rate is cut in half. And again, that's exactly what we're experiencing so far. So these predictions and expectations born out of a very close study of the historical experience are coming true so far all too realistically and all too unfortunately. But rather than look for some early, quick, brilliant, politically inspired revival, I think we have to be prepared for a slow period and hopefully one that does not get a lot worse in the meanwhile. The politicians, of course, don't want to admit that. They want to take measures that they can claim got us out of the problem. And it's right, of course, to try to minimize the difficulty. But the United States, right now, faces not just a political problem, though it faces a deep political problem, but it faces a genuine economic problem. On the one hand, the economy is obviously sluggish and slowed down. There's some risk of a double-dip recession. I personally do not predict that. I'm more inclined to think we'll have steady but very slow and sluggish growth in the 1 to 2% range for the next couple of years. But it's possible we could have a recession. Again, in any event, we've got a big slowdown. And in that circumstance, you would normally look to policy, both fiscal policy and monetary policy at the Federal Reserve, to expand, to try to take expansionary steps in order to strengthen the growth rate, bring unemployment down more rapidly. However, we've got the huge budget deficit. As I say, it's already doubled. It's on an unsustainable path. And even though the politicians haven't done anything about it yet, they realize you can't just jack up the deficit further in order to deal with the short-run problem. In that circumstance, where you have to tighten fiscal policy, you say, ah, well, there's still an out, the Federal Reserve. Monetary policy should be expansionary. You have a policy mix, you tighten fiscal, you expand monetary, and so you then have a reasonable policy balance. But you can't do that much either, because the Federal Reserve has already reduced interest rates close to zero. It's already gone through 2 rounds of so-called quantitative easing, where it basically prints money and puts it out into the economy, tries to stimulate demand in that way. They can't do much more. And so the U.S. is literally on the horns of a genuine policy dilemma. And that underlies a lot of the political posturing and frustration and inaction that we see from our political forces. That's the picture of the U.S. in a nutshell, and I'll be happy to come back to more details in the future in the discussion if you want. The other big picture point to make about the economic outlook is that it could get a lot worse. There are some crisis risks here within the United States, particularly running off the big budget deficit. If at some point the financial markets decide to punish the United States for having a big budget deficit, the way they've punished Greece and other European countries lately, then we too could be in trouble. So far, the effect of the European crisis has been to push money into the dollar, into U.S. treasuries, push our interest rates down, and in fact, in the short-run sense, help us. We've been the beneficiaries of the bad fortune, bad results, bad policies in Europe. But that may not always be the case. And those projections of the U.S. budget deficit I mentioned mean that our numbers, in less than 10 years, would look like Greece's today. So we're on a path to look like Greece in less than a decade. And that's worrisome for anybody, I think, and means at some point, if we don't start to get our act together, the bond markets, the bond vigilantes will possibly turn on us, and then we could be in big soup. The bigger risk of crisis, however, and that's the final chunk I want to talk about, is Europe. Europe right now is literally flirting with a huge financial crisis. It's a combination of sovereign debt problems and bank insolvency problems. Greece is insolvent as a country.
it's absolutely clear that its debt will have to be restructured, and the media will call that a default, and that could set off all sorts of alarm bells and repercussions depending how it's done. But if it were only Greece, no big problem. It's only 3% of the European economy. But once a single problem like Greece or Lehman here 3 years ago begins to develop, there inherently occurs through the processes of the financial markets what we call contagion. People say, wow, wait a minute, if that's the case in Greece, what about Portugal, whose numbers look distressingly similar, or Ireland, which has even bigger problems with its banks? Well, even those three are only 7% of the European economy, not such a big deal. But since the Europeans have dithered in dealing with it, then comes the question, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not just those three, maybe it's some of the bigger European countries. So anxiety spread early in the summer to Spain and particularly Italy. Italy, incidentally, has the third biggest government debt in the world, third only behind the United States and Japan. So if its bonds were to literally become suspect, you would have one very large number of bond holders around the world who would take huge hits and would be in big trouble, and that would spill through our economies. So you've got at least 5 major countries in Europe who have significant sovereign debt problems. My own view is that only Greece is insolvent, but the others are sufficiently flirting with the problem that unless Greece and the whole system there is resolved much more effectively than so far, they could all have significant difficulty. That in turn flags the second problem, the problem of the banks. Because European banks in particular, US banks a little, but European banks in particular, have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of euro credits to those governments. So if those governments were to go belly up, those banks would go belly up. And those banks make up a huge part of the European financial system. And that in a nutshell is the risk. So if the sovereigns don't resolve their difficulties, and if contagious through the banks, the European economy will be in deep, deep difficulty. And that would translate through to our economy and the world economy, of course, through the interdependence of financial institutions. Recession in Europe would, of course, then drag down the world economy as a whole. Remember, the European economy is bigger than ours. The European Union is a bigger economic unit than the United States now. So if they really went into a severe and sharp turndown, driven once again by a financial implosion, that would be poison for the world as a whole. Now, because this is so important, let me try to put it in perspective, and then I'll open up for questions. The current problems of the European economies derive importantly from their having created the single currency, the euro, 12 years ago. The European countries, therefore, do not, as individual countries, have the kind of policy options that the United States or other national economies with their own currencies have. In other words, Greece cannot devalue its currency to improve its competitiveness. It's part of the euro system, which is anchored by Germany, which is the world's biggest trade surplus country, and therefore promotes a strong exchange rate for the common currency, the euro. So Greece would actually have to exit the eurozone if it wanted to devalue its currency and improve its competitiveness that way, and that would be just such a huge disruption, they don't even want to think about it, and certainly the rest of the eurozone does not want to either. So then you might say, well, so why did they do this euro? What is this euro, and why did it happen? And that's, to me, likely to explain how they're going to come out of the crisis, so I spend 3 minutes on it. The euro is the latest manifestation of the European integration process, which I regard as the most historically significant development in the second half of the 20th century. Now, that's a strong statement, because the Soviet Union fell, communism ended, China rose, all sorts of things happened in the second half of the 20th century. I regard, more important than any of those, the integration of Western Europe. Why? Well, think back to the previous millennium, the previous 1,000 years. Go back to Agincourt. Go back to the 30 Years' War. For 1,000 years, most dramatically, of course, in the first half of the 20th century, the Europeans slaughtered each other. And the 2 world wars were only the latest but most devastating manifestation of it. But the Europeans slaughtered each other for 1,000 years. And after the Second World War, they came to the profound conclusion that the only way that they could tie their own hands against each other in the future was to go to the other extreme and integrate. And end, for all practical purposes, national sovereignty. And link themselves together in an indissoluble union so that no more would it ever be conceivable that they would fight each other. And in that sense, they have succeeded. Who today would ever think of the possibility of another war between Germany and France? No one, I think, in his right mind. So in that sense, the Europeans succeeded. Their chosen instrument was economic integration, to tie their economies together so tightly that it would be literally impossible for them to mount national militaries that would fight each other and have any motive to fight each other in the future. Because if their economic links became so intertwined, going to war with each other would, of course, destroy their own livelihood, as well as, again, put bloodshed on the table. So they resolved to integrate, and they began to do it with the common market. Got rid of all the trade barriers. Then they moved to the single market. They got rid of all internal, or in principle, they haven't done it in practice fully, but get rid of most of their internal barriers. Harmonize policies, harmonize regulations, tax systems, the whole range of things, so that they could have a truly unified economy, always seeking to pursue that security and fundamental political goal of avoiding the risk of future conflict. Having achieved that after about the first 30 or 40 years of the exercise, they then said, but the crowning glory that will make this irrevocable for all time will be to unify our currencies. Get rid of the French franc, get rid of the Deutsche Mark, get rid of the Italian lira. Link our currencies into a euro so that once and for all we are indissoluble. So they cooked up a scheme called Economic and Monetary Union, which then was to be the guidepost for the future of all time for Europe. They succeeded brilliantly in putting together the monetary union part of that. They created the single currency, the euro. They created a European central bank to be, for all practical purposes, the equivalent of our Federal Reserve, to run monetary policy for the whole of Europe in a common way. But they failed to put together the economic part of the Economic and Monetary Union. They had no common fiscal policy. They had no economic governance system that would run the place in a unitary, unified, and coherent manner. Now, they assumed that once they put the monetary stuff in place, that the rest of it would follow. There'd be a dynamic, a momentum, a kind of bicycle theory, and all that would then ensue more or less naturally. But it did not. There was a boom, as the world economy had a boom through most of the last decade, so times were good, why mess around further? Live with what you've got, and all will be well. So what happened was, in a strange way, like the United States, when the crisis came, they were just not ready to handle it. If a crisis, like happened to Greece, happened to Alabama, we would have very natural mechanisms to deal with it. Taking Alabama as a poor sister, I don't mean to knock Alabamans who may be here, but using it as a proxy, say that's the poor state, like Greece is the poor European country, we would transfer via stealth and with nobody knowing about it, we would transfer wealth from our richer states, the Germanys of the United States, that would go through our federal budget process to the poor countries, Alabama. Nobody would notice, but it's a fiscal transfer within a fiscal union. But the Europeans don't have that. Likewise, people in poor Rust Belt states, Ohio, Michigan, would move to prospering Sun Belt states, California, Arizona, and so if the economies of the Rust Belt weakened, as they did a decade or so ago, a lot of the American workers there would sort of pick up shop, and they would move to where business was booming in the Sun Belt. They'd take the jobs there, they'd exploit that, and the economy as a whole would still do well. Well, it's not as easy to move from Greece to Germany as it is to move from Ohio to California. Language is one obvious problem, culture is another, Mediterranean-style life versus Teutonic-style life is another big difference. And so it just, you don't have the same labor mobility within the European Union that you have within the American Union. And so those two big differences mean that Europe does not have the adjustment mechanisms that our federal united currency union has. And so when they face a crisis, they have to try to do it ad hoc. And that's what they've been doing for 2 years, putting together ad hoc bailouts, rescues, and because there are 27 countries in the European Union, 17 that have the euro as their currency, it is a very difficult political task to put all that together. And it's an even more difficult political task to present it in a coherent, logical, and persuasive way to the rest of the world, including the markets that are judging your behavior every day. In short, in Europe, you have a cacophony of policies, but also enunciation of those policies, which means that the world as a whole increasingly loses confidence that you're ever going to get your act together. And that's why the markets pummel, not just Greek bonds, but now Italian bonds, why the European Central Bank has to step in with almost unlimited rescues, but we all know that's not the job for a central bank to do forever. So the Europeans are in a pivotal position. Will they be able to get their act together to overcome this huge structural gap in their whole economic system? And that's got different time dimensions. In the short run, they've got to put together a huge rescue facility that will restore confidence that they can take care not just of Greece, but even Spain and Italy if they really get in trouble. For the longer run, they've got to move to a fiscal union with an economic governance system of the type that would more or less approximate the United States. Now again, I come out on the relatively optimistic side. I and my institute just 3 weeks ago ran a huge conference on this just outside of Paris. We actually ran a war game. We had former top officials from all the European countries, from the banks, from the IMF, the European Central Bank, and we literally ran a 2-day war game where people played the roles of each of the main actors in this drama and worked through over a 2-year future time horizon how it would play out. The result of that game, but I think in real life it's beginning to happen as well, is that the Europeans will put together a huge bailout facility worth something like $500 billion. They will then hook it up with their central bank, the European Central Bank, through a leveraging scheme, a lot of borrowing, a lot of financing, financial engineering between them, to lever that scheme up to something like 3 to 5 trillion euros, which, once they have that in place, should inspire confidence, I would say, worldwide, that even if Italy were to have solvency problems, they would be able to deal with it. They can take 100 billion of that or so, give it to Greece. Greece can use it to buy back a lot of its debt at the 50% discount where it's now selling in the markets and reduce its debt problem to a manageable level. So I think they are going to answer the problem in the short run, but it's nip and tuck. They may fail to do so. Some Germans grumble about paying for Greek pensioners, although the fact is that Germany is by far the biggest beneficiary of the euro system, and I think will continue to support it as need be. But it's touch and go, literally in these next few days and weeks, whether the Europeans will do it. I think if we get through the next 3 months, then it will be okay. They'll be on to the longer run, and we'll deal with the problem on a more lasting basis over time, restoring confidence in that European integration process that I talked about. But that is the #1 immediate risk to the world economy. I dwell on it because it's such a fascinating case in the evolution of the global economy, economic policy, creating a single currency, which incidentally, one of these days, if they do get their act together, will rival the dollar as the chief economy in the world. They're a bigger economy, they've got bigger reserves, they trade more. So in lots of ways, they are superior to us too, but they've got to obviously get through this rough patch before they can think of doing that. So that's the picture. At the end of the day, my bottom line is that there are lots of perils, but on the whole, I do come away still relatively, cautiously optimistic. Half the world is booming. The U.S. has got to learn to accept a sluggish economy for a few more years, but I don't think it'll drop into a new recession. The Europeans could bring us all down with a new financial crisis, but I think they're going to get their act together. However, some of you may disagree, some of you may have questions and challenges to that. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you again, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thanks a lot. Questions all over. Earl. Let me recognize Earl Bates, who's our marshal tomorrow and has been so gracious as to let our class use Coleman Hall a couple times tomorrow. Earl.
On the national scene, last year the President's Commission, Simpson-Bowles report came out, you know how it was, 4 to 5 trillion. It gained no traction. We saw the can kick down the road further. Congress didn't move on it. The President seems to be a little bit pleased with his so-called 1.5 to 1.8 that he thinks over the next 10 years. What's it going to take for Congress, and I know it's a political issue more than straight economic, but what's it going to take, because we're borrowing 42, 46 cents on every dollar we spend every day.
Absolutely.
The deficit's getting worse, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 trillion this year. It's adding to the cumulative total. So what's it going to take in the political sense for this thing? And sure, the new commission is coming up. What's it going to take for this thing to hold?
The sad truth is it's probably going to take a massive crisis to force the U.S. to get its house in order. I mean, that's a prediction of despair. I hate to make it. I've spent my life promoting constructive, preemptive policies to avoid economic disaster.
Will it be a black swan event?
Inherently, you can't predict what's going to be the unpredictable crisis that will drive the U.S. economy down, but it could be a black swan event, meaning something that happens once 100 years. Many people, like my good friend, but he failed badly, Alan Greenspan, called the crisis of 3 years ago a black swan event. He and Tim Geithner continue to say once in 100 years. Well, it may be back in 3. You know, not such a black swan. But the point is, the fair one, we don't know what could be the trigger. I mentioned one, which is that at some point, let's say the Europeans get their act back together over the next 2 or 3 years. At some point, the markets could turn with a vengeance on the United States. Look at those debt numbers of ours that I mentioned. See the lack of resolve by our political system to do anything about it. And sell treasuries and sell dollars. And our interest rates shoot up, and our currency plummets, and then we're forced to act in the worst of circumstances. But that, I'm afraid, and I hate to say it, but I'm afraid that is the realistic prognosis. The analogy is with the TARP. You remember what happened when the Lehman bankruptcy occurred literally 3 years ago now. Hank Paulson responded by bailing out everybody in sight, had to, and then came to the Congress subsequently to get the money with the infamous TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program. But you remember what happened in the first round. When he took the TARP to the House of Representatives, they voted it down. They voted it down. In the next 3 days, the stock market dropped 2,000 points. The Friday of that week, after they turned it down on Monday, they had to support it. They voted it in favor, the Senate then passed, it came into law, and that's when the U.S. rescue began, and began the recovery of the U.S. from the depths of that crisis. What I had hoped, this is a perverse hope, I admit, but what I had hoped was we had a moment like that in early August. You remember when the run-up to the great congressional budget deal, when the brinksmanship, particularly from the Congress, was literally facing the U.S. with the possibility of default on Treasury obligation. Congress, the Republicans in Congress were not going to pass the extension of the debt ceiling, and that would force the U.S. into default, and it would have, no doubt about it, unless congressional action were taken. I was hoping that that would kind of turn out to be a kind of delayed TARP, where, okay, the U.S. would declare default, the markets would savage the United States, and that would shock us into putting our act together. But no, the Congress headed it off. But as I said before, they headed it off with nothing. The first stage of the great revenue bill, budget bill, was for the Congress to work out budget cuts of $1 trillion, about $1 trillion, over the next year. But remember, every one of those budget cuts has to go through the regular process, the appropriations committees and the full votes of the Congress, and it's no more, to me, than a normal budget resolution, which are almost always ignored in practice. Then there's the second stage, you mentioned, the super committee, which is now meeting. It's supposed to come up with another $1.5 trillion. That's stage 2, to kick in 2013, and if not, funds are supposed to be sequestered across the board. I'll bet almost everybody in the room here a steak dinner, it's never going to happen. Super committee will never come to agreement. Even if it did, all that's then got to be approved by the Congress, and they set it up specifically to take place in 2013. That's when the new Congress comes in. No Congress can bind a future Congress. New Congress can turn it around. Well, but then the law they passed in August said, but if there's no action, sequestration takes place. Budgets are cut across the board. Senator McCain and 50 others are already saying, well, no, because that would cut half of the budget out of the Defense Department, and we can't have that, and so we'll have to repeal that if anything like that looks like happening. And that's a year or so before it's even likely to come up. So don't believe any of that you heard. Assume that the U.S. government so far has done essentially nothing to change that trajectory that I talked about. Deficits of $1 trillion a year, as far as the eye can see, at least the next decade, even if the economy recovers modestly. A trajectory headed toward over 200% of the economy in terms of federal debt, which is so far off the charts that it would be blown out of the water long before that. But I'm afraid that's a long answer because it's a very important point. I'm glad you raised it. I'm afraid the answer is a deep crisis. Now, there are optimists who point out that in the 1990s, we did, in fact, eliminate a large budget deficit. It was 6% of GDP at the end of the Reagan-Bush 41 period, 1993. From running deficits of 6% of the economy in 93, we improved so much over the next decade that by 2001, we were running a surplus of 2% of GDP. So, and then it was thrown away in the early part of the last decade with tax cuts, wars, unchecked government expenditure. But that showed we could do it. However, at that time, it probably was easier. The end of the Cold War helped a couple percent of GDP. So it's much tougher now. But we did do it, and that's what the optimists remind us of in countering my high degree of pessimism.
How can, you mentioned the debt ceiling, how can the debt ceiling be anything more than smoke and mirrors if, I think it's the Article 4 of the Constitution says we will pay our debts? Yeah.
Now, the debt ceiling is a sham. It was used as a political excuse to try to force action. As I say, at the time, they took credit for having galvanized action around it, but it really didn't do anything. So it was a sham all the way around it. Your point is basically right. And I think at the end of the day, the president could invoke that article and just keep paying the debt. They don't want to do that. They'd obviously much rather do it through prudent fiscal policy. But if they had to at the end of the day, they probably would. Yeah.
How long do you think we have as a reserve currency for the world, and what can we do to turn it around?
Well, the question is, how long does the dollar have to continue as the world's dominant reserve currency? I actually did my first book on that topic way back a long time ago. It was my PhD thesis as well. The lesson of history is that inertia is a very powerful force in financial events. The incumbent has huge advantages. And to be dislodged from a dominant position, two things have to occur. First, there has to be a true rival. Now, the reason the US dollar was dominant for the last century is there was no rival. There was literally no currency based on an economy anywhere near the size of the United States, financial markets anywhere near our size. I always used to joke with Helmut Schmidt when he was Chancellor of West Germany. I was always trying to get the Germans to play a bigger role, and he would say, Fred, you know, the Deutschmark can never rival the dollar. West Germany is the size of your state of Oregon. So how could we possibly rival? And he's correct. Now, with the euro, despite its current troubles, there is an economy bigger than the United States. But comes China. And as I mentioned, my colleague's just done a book, we published it only 2 weeks ago, says China's going to become the dominant economy. The most provocative part of that very provocative general thesis is his prediction that the renminbi, the Chinese currency, will move up alongside the dollar within 10 to 20 years. Now, I think that's doubtful because the Chinese will have to get rid of a lot of capital controls. Their currency is not even convertible now in the way that the dollar, the euro, the yen, most currencies are. They keep it tightly controlled. That's part of the cheating I talked about before. And I don't think they're going to get rid of that quickly. But my colleague is right. If they did get rid of those controls and decided they wanted to go for it, and we continue to dither, and the Europeans continue to slump, the Chinese then have an open door. Because the second criterion for changing the role of currencies, the first one is it's got to be an alternative. Now there are two. But the second is the incumbent has to really mess up and vacate the field and let the other guy come in. But next 10, 20 years, given what I've been saying, could easily happen. And both the US and Europe, the incumbent and the most likely successor, both could foul up so badly as to leave the door open. And again, if the Chinese want it, they can probably move quickly. So it's a contingent answer. If we get our act together, we could probably maintain a large role for the dollar, I'd say another half century. But if we don't, it could happen much quicker. Footnote, and I won't go into it because it's too complicated, I do not believe that the dominant international role of the dollar is any more a good thing for the United States. Actually, I think it's a bad thing for the United States. Now, you can talk about that privately later on. That's a heterodox view. I've written that now several places. And so I, for one, would welcome an orderly decline in the dollar's role, not to eliminate it, but for the euro and the RMB to move up. But that's a different story and a little more complicated. Yes?
What scenario of events do you see as possibly bringing the United States back to getting its action over?
I mentioned that the question is what sequence might induce the U.S. to get its act together.
Well, I mean, that was an impetus, but I mean, what events do you think should occur?
Well, I was going to say, I mentioned that the U.S., against a lot of pessimism at that time too, did get its fiscal act together in the 1990s. Improved our budget position, 8% of the economy in 8 years. It was a really dramatic improvement. Bob Rubin was Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton when that happened. And I've discussed it with him a lot and said, Bob, how were you able to do that politically? His answer is fascinating. His answer is Ross Perot. And the point is that Ross Perot, with his funny ears and his funny charts, got 20% of the vote in the 1992 election and made discussion of the budget issue not only respectable, but almost essential. The point being, you need somebody who gets political traction to take on the budget issue in a serious way. The tragedy of our current political debate, whether it's the president or the would-be Republican nominees, none of them is taking any serious approach to the budget problem. To the contrary, they're continuing to feed the short-term desires not to touch Social Security, not to touch Medicare, not to raise taxes. Well, if you don't do any of those three things, you're going to have a fiscal crisis, which is the mother of all crises of all time. But for politicians to stand up and repeat Simpson-Bowles, the Simpson-Bowles Commission that Earl mentioned laid out the blueprint. It was only about half as ambitious as was necessary, but at least would have gotten us down the road. Then the gang of 6 senators, led by Mark Warner and several Republican counterparts, Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, they were working toward a similar bipartisan, comprehensive, balanced plan that would deal with problems. So it's not impossible. You can get bipartisan groups together. But then when it gets into the real political process, even the current super committee, it just runs afoul of everybody's short-term political horizons. That's the story so far. So using him as a proxy, we need a Ross Perot to come forth, get political traction, if not win, at least drive the issue to the forefront of the agenda. That's the alternative to a crisis. Hopefully that'll happen, but I have to say, can't see it at the moment. Garth?
Regulation in 1998, with the repeal of the last of Glass-Steagall, to some, perhaps you, made it possible for the kind of unusual fiscal crisis we have in this decade. So where are you in terms of deregulation versus regulation economically?
Well, as you know well, Garth, you can't ask the question in that broad a term because you need not regulation or deregulation. You need optimal regulation. You need the right amount to keep the excesses of the market system from exceeding stability bounds, but keep it sufficiently low-key as to not interrupt the functioning of the basic day-to-day economy. What happened on the financial side was, of course, that the whole regulatory system got totally out of whack, and it was not so much deregulation, although you mentioned one case, the final termination of Glass-Steagall, but what happened was that the regulators simply believed that the market system was going to be okay and self-regulate, so they failed to keep up with the evolution of the financial industry. The whole onset of subprime loans and AA, the whole mortgage finance industry, which in turn was the immediate trigger of our financial crisis, was ignored, basically ignored by the regulators. In fact, it was a little worse than that, because led by the Democrats in the Congress, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were not only approved but cheered on to do more adventuresome financial lending so that, quote, every American could live the American dream and buy a home. Well, it's an admirable dream and it's an admirable goal. But when you get millions of people taking out housing loans that they can't possibly finance, you're just building up the grounds for an inevitable huge crisis, which is basically what happened. So you always, whether it's finance or environment or any component of the economy, you have to find a degree of regulation that will prevent the excesses of the market system, which we've seen repeatedly through history, to tank the system itself without impeding the basic dynamic of that system. And that's a constant Hegelian process, moving between extremes and trying to find ways to reach that happy medium. And we probably never reach it. It's even very hard to define it. But that's the answer. And in the case of the financial system, it was a failure to achieve that balance, which if you have to point to one single underlying factor for this mess that we're still in that I've described, that was it. Anybody else?
What's the long-term consequences of demographic winter? Demographic winter?
Long-term consequence of demographic winter, I guess you mean the aging of the society. Well, it does mean relative decline, of course, in your economic growth and the size of your economy. But that's okay if you're still growing your productivity, increasing your income per capita. I mean, what you care about, I think, sensibly, is not whether you're the biggest economy in the world or the biggest economy in Europe or bigger than you were 100 years ago. It's whether the welfare of your people is consistently improving and reaching a level that satisfies most folks. And that's a per capita income concept. Japan, for example, is now in terminal decline. If you project the current Japanese demographic trend, the last Japanese will die at about 2300. Literally, the islands will be depopulated. Well, that won't quite happen. And that's the extreme case, but several of the European countries have already headed downward. The US is, of course, more rapidly growing with immigration at a somewhat higher growth rate, though our population will level off over the next several decades. But it's a matter of whether you can keep your productivity growth, your investment, your dynamism, your innovation rising sufficiently, even with a declining population, so that per capita welfare, at a minimum, does not decline, and at worst, and at best, continues to increase. Now, the underlying problem in the U.S., and most of you probably know this, the underlying problem in the U.S. is that median per capita income here is stagnant for the last 3 decades. I mean, that's stunning. There are recent new data that the average family income in the United States is lower today than it was 10 years ago. And so those are stunning factors. Japan is going through some similar numbers. Some of the European countries are. Now you can say, well, that's high-level stagnation. Say we're rich. Most Americans, not all by any means, most Americans are reasonably satisfied with their lives. You say, well, so that's kind of stagnant economy, but it's at a level of reasonable wealth and income, so you don't worry too much.
That's a recipe, of course, for then falling into decline, and increasing numbers of people will be unhappy. In our own economy, you know, the poverty numbers are staggering. They're growing, in part due to this recent turndown. But like I say, that turndown is not such a cyclical short-term phenomenon. So there are some pretty deep underlying problems in the U.S. economy. And when we think about our long-term position in the world relative to Europe, but particularly relative to China and the other rapidly growing emerging markets, it's a sobering thought that we may not be able too much longer to think of ourselves as the richest or most successful economy in the world.
Yeah, it seems to me like the housing mortgage mess is creating a lot of uncertainty, and that we need to get that cleaned up before the economy will get going. Would you agree with that, and how far along are we in that process?
Well, it goes back to what I said at the start. The deleveraging process is taking place to a large extent through the housing market. So if you could find a scheme to wave a wand and essentially forgive or forbear a large part of the existing mortgage debt, you would give a huge shot in the arm to the economy. There are two problems with that. One is all the people that have been faithfully paying their mortgages. Say, well, is it fair to them to give everybody else a write-off and essentially debt relief? But the bigger problem is who would pay for it. There are only two possibilities. One is the banks and the other holders of the debt, and if you force them to write off, then they're bust, and that causes a new financial problem. Therefore, the main alternative is the government. But the government's already spent huge amounts on bailouts. The government already has this massive budget deficit we talked about. And if you really had the government essentially take over and write off all the debts of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, not to mention all the private mortgage lenders around the country, you'd probably be doubling again the national debt and raising a whole additional set of problems. So it's a complicated business. You're absolutely right. That would be the, if there was a single magic bullet that could possibly restore economic growth and telescope the deleveraging process into a much shorter period of time, it would be a comprehensive write-off of the mortgage debt that now exists in the country. But nobody's been able to come up with a scheme that would do it without raising one or both of the problems that I cite, and at least so far, that's been, I think, unacceptable to really all quarters of the debate. It's not, I don't think that one's been a partisan issue. That one's been widely thought about, and at this point, agreed, you just cannot do it.
Maybe one more question.
One more question. I want to get the student there.
How would you compare the near bank collapse in the United States and the almost complete collapse of that of Iceland, and how the United States is, I guess, yet to recover, and still feeling the effects of recession, whereas Iceland, we didn't bail out the banks, and now experiencing comparable economic growth?
It's a very good question. I don't know how many of you have seen, what's the name of the movie? Have you seen the movie about the crisis? It starts with Iceland.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a great movie, and it starts with depicting the meltdown in Iceland. I made the comparison between the U.S. and Greece. You could make it with Iceland. Iceland was even more deeply in debt. It had, at one point, it was running a trade deficit equal to 25% of its economy. Its budget deficit, I think, got up to 30% of its economy. And yeah, its financial system was essentially wiped out. But then, you're right, they did a massive bailout. They got a lot of foreign credits to help them finance it, and so now they are clawing their way back. It's such a small country, relying on fish exports, that it's not too relevant to elsewhere. But it is an example, A, of how you can get deeply in trouble by letting the financial system overpower your whole economy. It got just way out of proportion. But then, a comprehensive response can deal with it. The current case that's most applicable is really Ireland, which is actually a pretty strong economy. The so-called Celtic Tiger had been growing very rapidly until recently, and it let three banks really just overlend and become insolvent, and the government had to bail them out so much that it led to a sovereign crisis, which then requires big bailouts from the IMF and the European Union. So the lesson, Iceland, Ireland, Greece to a large extent, and we to a big extent too, when you let your financial system become excessive over-leveraged, unregulated, you court the kind of financially driven turn down in your economy, which I mentioned at the outset, can then lead to prolonged misery. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Fred.